Hello, and welcome to another episode at Patient World. Today we have with us a fabulous guest. That's Chef Dr. Mike. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am excited and delighted to be here.
You have so much information to share with the audience. Why don't you start with telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, sure. I am a board certified interventional cardiologist. So to put that in context, when people would have a heart attack at 2 a.m., I was the guy that got called to go in and put those stents in. I'm also a professional chef and actually learned to cook professionally before I went to medical school.
Mm-hmm.
So food was on the front end of that, even though I worked in the back of the house. And currently, one of my many hats is that of a professor of culinary medicine, where I teach culinary medicine to all the students at the University of Montana, which is where I am now.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit more about culinary medicine. That's an interesting topic. Most people don't know about it.
It is, and it's understandable because it's still a bit of an emerging discipline. In some ways, it's very fascinating because it's probably one of the oldest forms of study. So when we go back and we look at, for example, some of the very early cookbooks from ancient Greece, we find that they were written by physicians because they appreciated how important what you ate was in terms of your health and wellness. And in fact, our modern word diet, which has become this verb people use to mean to lose weight, actually comes from an ancient Greek word called diaetia, which actually loosely translates more along the lines of living in a way of harmony. And I think that's really to get back to those roots. The roots of diet is to get back to the origins of that word. And really one of our main focuses in culinary medicine, in our culinary medicine approach, is to get back into that balance, into that center point, into that place of harmony, because that is really the wellspring from which we then can enjoy health, wellness, longevity, and happiness. And in terms of culinary medicine, if you Google it, I believe you'll get several million hits back. And so there are lots of different takes on what this is. Ours is a little bit different because we're not sort of a rehash of the last half century of a nutricentric focus, which is primarily derived about looking at food with a very narrow lens of nutrients and macro groups, things like carbohydrates and proteins and things like that. We're really focused on the food experience, the food relationship. And that involves from how the food is raised, how it is grown, how is it harvested, how is it processed or not processed, how do we prepare it, including these techniques, and then really how we eat. More and more, we're learning that as human beings, no surprise to you, we're pretty complicated. And so how we eat in terms of our attitudes, the composition of our gut bacteria, all these things play into what we derive in terms of a physiologic benefit from that food experience. And that ties into emotion. We process food, we process that food experience in the same area of our brain that we process sex. And so we have to understand that just as our personal relationships are complicated as social primates, our relationship with food is complicated. And our relationship with food is one of the very first relationships we have. We bond with our mothers over breast or bottle, and that sets an emotional connection from our very neonate times to food. And then for most of the history of the human species, food has been a form of social currency. Relationship therapists still use the romantic dinner as a form to engage in and explore emotion, relationships, and emotional health, which is so very important for our physical health. So all those things go into how we approach culinary medicine above and beyond simply looking at the percent sat fat or how many international units of vitamin A we've eaten today. And we're finding more and more that more holistic, inclusive approach is a critical analysis. Having said that, we work very hard to make sure we base our recommendations, our pursuits, how we approach culinary medicine on a solid evidence base.
As you were talking, I started thinking about the look on my baby's face the first time she had sweet potatoes. So we went from the bottle, you can imagine how nasty that stuff is, to sweet potatoes. And that smile on her face, I'll never forget. You know, I hadn't really thought so much about the pleasure centers in the brain associated with that. But, you know, there's a lot to be said about that, because even if you're having a really bad day, you get the right morsel in your mouth and it just can kind of turn it around.
Well, it doesn't. You just beamed, watching you're beaming when you were talking about that. And that's that connection that food can have in a very positive way. And let's face it, everyday life is hard. So when we can, have a meal that is positive, and when we remember something and it brings that positivity, that positive emotional connection back, those are powerful healing moments. And I certainly think you look at, all you have to do is turn on the news, right, and it's pretty clear we need a double dose of as much of that as is possible. Stat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Being an interventional cardiologist, you have seen the extremes of a poor diet. You've seen the clogged arteries and the weak heart as a result. And, a lot of people, they just don't make it. The heart attack being, the leading cause of death. And so what can you tell the audience? What would be the most important points that you want to leave with them about your diet and how that can impact your life?
Well, I think, a couple of key points. One is that 80%, and this isn't Chef Dr. Mike's data, right? They can go to the American Heart Association website and look this up. 80%, and you heard that right, 8 out of 10 heart attacks can be prevented with lifestyle modifications like culinary medicine.
That's huge.
So that is huge, because as you just mentioned, it's the number one cause of death in this country and many other industrialized, westernized nations around the world. So the first one is the magnitude of the impact that you can have in your own life that is in your control with the dietary choices you make. The second is that it's not about depriving yourself and being miserable for the rest of your life by only going out and chewing tree bark and grazing,
like you Gibbons.
Yeah, exactly. You don't need to do that. And in fact, I often say there is no salvation in deprivation. And the best example that I can give folks, I think, to take away, to use a pun, as you'll see in a minute, is pizza. So what we have found, and the data has supported this. Now, I came out with this about the same time that something called the NOVA classification was being developed in 2009 at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, which looked at food differently. And it said, a steak is not necessarily bad, but a highly processed hamburger seems to be. What is the difference? And what they determined, Professor Monteiro and his colleagues, was that it was the level of what we call ultra processing. And so ultra processed foods, as we study them in culinary medicine, have a very specific and rigorous definition that we go through to identify them. But if we take a look at a pizza, and I'll make clear why I bring this up in a minute, besides the fact that I love pizza and I eat it every day, is that we can have a pizza that we order from a chain. And pizza in general has been described as one of the 10 worst foods that you could possibly eat on this planet in terms of your health. And when you order that, meat lover special from that chain, that's exactly right. It is definitely one of the 10 worst foods. Mm-hmm. So push that to the side and let's take a trip, you and I, to Napoli, Italy, right? When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, it's amore in Italy. And how do we craft that traditionally? Well, it's a dough. It's a crust made with organic flour, water, salt, yeast. That's it. And then we're going to put a topping on that. What is that? That's crushed tomatoes, a little salt. Then we're going to put a topping on. That's some wonderful organic buffalo mozzarella, some fresh basil, maybe a drizzle of really good olive oil.
I'm getting hungry here.
Yeah, and that is probably one of the 10 best foods you could put in your body in terms of the nutrients that you're eating, the carbohydrates supplying the gut bacteria, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm driving towards is that it's not about, do I eat a pizza or do I not eat a pizza? You can eat a pizza. It's about what kind of pizza. And it's about a new lens through which we view food, especially in this country, where almost 70% of the food the average American eats is ultra processed food. And start looking at it through that lens and saying, I'm not going to do that, but I am going to have a pizza and enjoy it. And the reason I bring that up, because there was a recent Italian study published just a few weeks ago. And of course, it was an Italian study, right? It had pizza, where they did that same exact thing. Mm-hmm. And they looked at it and they said, well, these chains, the pizzas, for example, we're going to put them because they're ultra processed food in the ultra processed food category. But the homemade pizza, the pizzas made from scratch like that, wine, real cheeses, Parma ham, etc., those are not ultra processed foods. So we're going to put them in a different category. And what they found is that what we just described in terms of that handmade pizza Napolitano, is that it was associated with a reduction in cardiovascular events. It was associated with a reduction in mortality. The risk seems to lie in the ultra processing of the foods. And that also explains a lot of the confusion for the last half century, because until we have the knowledge base to properly identify, it's why we said eggs were bad when they weren't bad, why we said avoid red meat when maybe we didn't have to, and so on and so forth. Why we said, wow, it's you have to stay away from avocados because they've got saturated fat, when avocados are really good for us. It has to do with really returning to our roots and eating the foods that we and our gut bacteria over millions of years have evolved to thrive upon.
That's fascinating. That is so important. I was going to ask you later, but I have to go now. Help me tell the audience about your books.
So I've got a couple of books. The most recent one is Food Shaman. And if somebody was looking, well, where do I start? Some of the things I was just talking about, that I spoke about those in a book called The Fallacy of the Calorie, which came out some years ago, but that data set is still very robust. The predictions that I've made in that book, things like, we don't need to pay attention to the amount of cholesterol that's in our diet because it has no effect on our blood lipid levels, and there's no reason that there should be dietary guidelines. That actually came true several years ago. The government got rid of the dietary requirements, restricting us to 300 milligrams of cholesterol a day. And for the folks out there, that's about one egg. Average egg has about 280 grams of cholesterol in the yolk. And they got rid of that. So if they read that particular book, they'll see that a lot of those predictions, the predictions about the importance of the gut microbiome, those really have come true. And that provides a very solid scientific evidence base for what I talk about in the Food Shaman, which then builds on that and looks at some of these softer edges that I mentioned, which is, how does our mental state, how we eat, where we eat, when we eat, with whom we eat, how do these things affect, or even do they affect our health? Mm-hmm. And to give a teaser, as we say, the answer is they can very powerfully impact our health. So, for example, there is, as you know, something called telomere length, which for the audience out there, telomeres, if you can imagine them, if you don't have the fancy new ones and use the old fashioned shoelaces like I do on your tennis shoes, you'll see those little plastic caps, at the end that keeps the threads from fraying. Those are what we have on our cells that cap our DNA, and they're called telomeres. And the longer they are, the better they are. And it's a measure of how we physiologically age. So certainly we count the years that we're here on the planet, but people age differently sort of internally on our own biological clock, right? We've all had that person we went to high school with that looks fantastic. They're like, you haven't changed in 20 years. And then we see somebody else and we're like, oh gosh, it's absurd. You saw crossing the street and they're 23 years old. They've aged, really, really quickly. So measuring that, we can actually measure that telomere length and get an idea of our physiologic aging. Two important studies were done. One which actually looked at types of exercises that we utilize and incorporate in our culinary medicine approach called MB Eats, which are mindfulness-based eating awareness techniques. It's a type of sort of mindfulness exercise. And what this study found is that people that engage in those types of activities every day, it actually helps prevent the shortening of those telomeres. So in other words, engaging in mindfulness, when we sit down to eat, and it doesn't have to be every meal because that's not practical, but certainly maybe several times a week, maybe if you can do it at an evening meal and a morning meal when you start your day, that is associated with slowing down your rate of physiologic aging, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And on the flip side of that, when they looked specifically at the variable of what people ate in terms of, is this an ultra-processed food or is it not? When you eat a lot of ultra-processed foods, it increases your rate of physiologic aging, which makes sense because the consumption of ultra-processed foods like that is associated with a higher risk of overall total mortality, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, certain types of cancers, inflammatory bowel diseases, etc. And we know that those are chronic disabilities and diseases, the likelihood of which increases as we get older. So some very interesting information that really hits at our own internal fountain of youth.
That is fascinating. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the gut microbiome and how that impacts things.
Well, I like to say this is usually a 2 to 4 glass of wine conversation, because it gets to this space which can be a little uncomfortable for some people. So we'll put the warning on the screen, viewer discretion advised, because it is really fascinating. So the things that we have learned, certainly I'm pretty ancient. So when I was in medical school, I was taught, well, there's some bacteria, they live in the colon. They don't really do much, but they're there because there's things that we eat that we can't digest and they can eat them. And that's about it. And to the point where we are today, where we consider the gut microbiome an organ in and of itself. We carry about 2 pounds worth of bacteria in our body, in our gut. And so it's essentially another 2-pound organ. And what we have learned is it talks to us all the time. And there's this constant traffic going back between the gut and the brain. And not only is it communicating to the brain, sort of letting us know things, but it influences our emotional state. So, for example, if you eat a meal that makes certain types of bacteria happy, those happy bacteria then secrete something called serotonin. They secrete that in the gut, which has a lot of local effects, but it also goes into our bloodstream, goes up into our brain. For people who suffer depression, one of the medications we give them acts to increase the available levels of serotonin in the brain. And so literally, if you eat something that makes the bacteria in your gut happy, they make you happy.
Like a natural Prozac, huh?
It is a natural Prozac, but it also gets into this very Twilight Zone conversation, which is why I say it's usually good to have this at the end of the day over a glass of wine or two when you can reflect a little bit, because then we're starting to say, well, who's controlling who? Who's really driving what we eat? Is it this bacteria that we're craving, these things because it's making them happy and they're influencing our behavior on our brain? Certainly what we eat influences the composition of our bacteria and then drives our emotion, our choices, and drives our physiologic health in one direction or the other. More communication that occurs. So these bacteria are very much in touch with our immune system, which we know is very powerfully impacted and tied to emotional states like depression. Right. So as a cardiologist, I can tell you that depression is as potent a risk factor for developing heart disease and then recurrent heart disease if you have it, in terms of the severity of the MI, recurrent MI, complications, as any cholesterol level. But we just don't have great treatments, and we certainly have no really good way to quantify that when we compare that to measuring a cholesterol level that shows an LDL, of this type at this level, and I can give you a pill and then measure it, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks later. And so we tend to skew both our treatment algorithms and also our science and our focus on what we can measure, because in Western medicine, we love to measure things. Yeah. We love numbers because that allows us to categorize and develop things. But to get to the heart of the matter, we also know as a cardiologist that people that have strong social support, have healthy, loving relationships with a partner or spouse, have a significantly reduced level when we correct for cholesterol level, hypertension, family history, smoking, all these other things, compared to people that don't. And as a scientist, what does that tell me? That tells me love is a powerful medicine. It is a powerful preventive medicine. But I can't write a script for 12 love units, every morning or evening. I probably could, but that would probably get me in a lot of trouble with certain. And I'm sure, the insurance companies would have issues reimbursing that. But the point of that being to say that just because I can't quantify it and I can't write a prescription for a pill, it does not mean that effect is invalid. Sure. It is real and it is there. Something that in statistics we call the black swan effect. Meaning, if you come and you say, hey, Chef Dr. Mike, what's my likelihood of seeing a black swan? And I say, well, have you ever seen one? And you say, no. And it's like, well, I have no idea. I can't predict what your likelihood is. Mm-hmm. Does that extrapolate to meaning black swans aren't real? No, of course they aren't. We know that because people have seen them. So it's sort of that black swan effect, which permeates medicine. One of the most important things, and this is actually, part of our cardiology boards. We have a statistics, and I'm a bit of a nerd. So I enjoy learning, what the limitations are, where it's applicable and where it can't be applied. And one of the first things that we learn is that, hey, you have to be able to quantify, to apply statistics, to develop these algorithms. If you can't measure it, then you can't apply any of those quantitative analyses. The caveat to that is that it doesn't mean that the effect isn't real. It just means we can't measure it. We haven't figured it out yet. We're not that smart. And so often I see that neglected in the total calculus of developing regimens and programs and algorithms, which is why we try to include those softer edges into what we do. And fortunately for us, the science is catching up, in those areas.
Now I want to talk a little bit about oil. I went to your site and it's full of great information, and we're going to let the viewers know how to reach you. But I am an olive oil fanatic. I used to just like canola oil and so forth. My mother used to tell me olive oil, that's the best stuff. And as a child, like, doesn't taste good. But now I put olive oil. I use olive oil as a dip for my celery, for carrots. I spray it on my crackers. So you have some very interesting information about oil on your site. Can you share that with our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I, like you, I love olive oil. I'm a big fan of Mediterranean style cooking. You heard me, my commentary on the pizzas and even, drizzling it. So first thing, I tell folks is there's olive oil you can use for everyday cooking, which is what I do, which is even just a virgin, good quality, no GMO, additive type of things. But you buy that in bulk. You don't need to be cooking with your $12 for 8 ounces olive oil. Okay, so there's two kinds of olive oil. There's everyday cooking olive oil, which I use. And then there's really good olive oil, which is cold pressed, extra virgin, different types of olive oil. And people should understand that you can explore those like you explore wines. Coming from different countries, different areas, they'll have different tastes. Some are very green and vegetable, some are sort of almost hot and peppery. So taste them, find which ones you like.
Mhm.
Go ahead and use those. And then the third thing I will tell you is a little chef trick is to use flavored olive oil. So for example, when I'm cooking with rosemary, again Italian, I save the little bits where the fresh rosemary comes on, those kind of little woody stems.
Uh-huh.
You could either use those for skewers if you're doing fish or meat or even vegetables, and it will infuse a rosemary flavor into your food. So you can do that for free instead of throwing it away. But you can also then drop those in some heated olive oil. Just pull it off the heat and just let that infuse for an hour or two. Strain it off, and then you have a rosemary infused olive oil that you can then put on your potatoes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of, again, one aspect of our culinary medicine, something we call the zero waste kitchen approach, where normally you might throw those things away, but you can use them. And it's good for your budget,
Mhm.
and it's also good for the planet. So that we encourage that.
Well, that's what I
So
was doing wrong. I didn't heat the olive oil. I was putting things, the flavor, like I don't taste the flavor.
yeah,
Now I know what to do differently.
Yeah, so you bring it up in the saucepan. You'll see it's just start to shimmer. You don't
Mhm.
want to get it smoking because then it's gonna be too hot, and it can actually start to burn what you put in it, and you'll get kind of that really nasty, acrid, burnt taste to it. But just bring it up to where it gets to a shimmer. Take it off. Go ahead and put whatever you want in there, and you can infuse lots of things. A great thing to do is in the summer when you can grow a lot of these, herbs. Obviously, right? I live in Montana. I have big herb beds in the summer. In the fall, I'll do some flavored olive oils to use up the last of some of those fresh things that I might not be able to pick up in the supermarket. We can always maybe find sage and thyme, but if I've got other kinds of flavors, winter savory, summer savory, chervil, things that you may not come across, you can always put them into an oil or vinegar and infuse them as well. So the same thing that I just said with the oil, you can do with the vinegar, heat it up, put your rosemary in, and you have a rosemary flavored vinegar. And because it's vinegar, it preserves it. And that stuff will just last forever. So I absolutely love olive oil, cooking with olive oil. One of the great reasons that it's so good to cook with is that it's what we call a monounsaturated oil. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but people have heard of saturated fats,
Mhm.
and people have heard of unsaturated fats, and people may have heard of a lot of controversy recently about these polyunsaturated vegetable oils and etc. And there's a simple way to explain kind of how they work and why they work and what this leads to. So in a bit of interpretive theater, if you can imagine, fats are made up of different chains of carbons and hydrogens. And so if I was a carbon molecule and I put my two hands up and I put my 2 feet up, and I do that to the person next to me who's also a carbon molecule, then I have no free appendages. I can't kind of move anywhere. And if you have a whole lot of us in a line, we're in a straight line and we're very stable because our hands and feet are touching the person next to us and we can't really move. That's what's called a saturated fat. And it's called saturated because our arms and legs are these bonds that carbon has, and they're saturated because every one of them is touching something. So
Mhm.
there's no point of rotation back and forth about that. And that's why when you heat animal fats, lard, tallow, schmaltz, which is chicken fat, etc., It's very stable at higher temperatures when you're cooking in it or if you're going to fry, because all those carbon bonds are saturated and they have nowhere to move. So it's a very, what we call stable. And because it's very stable like that, that's why we often see it solid at room temperature. Olive oil is what we call a monounsaturated fat, which means at one point in this line of people where we're touching our hands and feet, one of my hands is free. So there's what we call one carbon double bond. And because my hand is free, I can wave it around. And because I'm not attached, that line can now move on that one singular pivot point. So that's a monounsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated just means that at many different spaces, my hands aren't connected to my neighbor and their hands aren't connected to their neighbor. And so as you can imagine, as we heat that oil, that allows points of rotation where those carbon bonds aren't occupied. And that's where we get into what we call cis or trans. People have heard of trans fats, which when they're artificial are very bad for us, as we've learned. And so what can happen, for example, in a trans fat is when I have those bonds and I'm free to move, I can rotate this way. And if I rotate this way, that whole line of people now has a certain configuration, and we could call one of those configurations trans. And if I were to come to you the other way, then we could call that other configuration when we rotate about that cis. And that's where actually the term cis and trans fats comes from. And I was a chemistry major. So and I never thought I'd ever use that, but that's actually what happens. Anytime we heat oils to high temperatures, we get those changes. So even though it may say, no trans fats per serving on a bag of potato chips, because they were cooked in very high vegetable oils, there are trans fats there. The government labeling allows us to say 0 if there's less than 0.5 milligrams per serving. If a serving is one potato chip, you get the idea what happens when you eat a bag. You're getting lots of trans fats. When you cook with those polyunsaturated vegetable oils at home at high temperatures, you are creating those trans fats. You're also, because there's so many pivot points, creating all these other compounds. For example, you create, over taking a vegetable oil, over 50 different kinds of new cis fats that we have no idea what their effects are in the human body, but they're created by heating those oils to high temperatures. We also create other things that we now know are not very good for our body, called advanced glycylation end products. Easy way to remember those, it's just called AGEs. And that's what they seem to do to our body. They increase oxidation, which is believed to be one of the mechanisms by which we age our body. So when we were talking earlier about those telomeres and we want to keep them long, eating lots of things fried and involving those polyunsaturated vegetable oils at high temperatures may be shortening those telomeres. Those types of oils and the products of that oil processing, that oil heating, and that oil cooking are what are found and one of the hallmarks of ultra processed foods. So we start to see how these pieces of the puzzle, are vaguely starting to connect, together. So when you go to that fast food restaurant and you're getting that ultra processed food that involves all these manipulated oils, we see how that ties back into the ultra processing. And a lot of what goes into the production of those oils generates these compounds, which are not disclosed. There's no government regulation in terms of having to disclose AGEs and other types of compounds that are produced in the production of oils through things like hexane extraction, high temperatures that they go through. And those are hallmarks of ultra processed foods. One sort of easy way to remember ultra processed foods are, if you couldn't make this in your kitchen, the way that it's being served to you or packaged to you, it's probably an ultra processed food.
That's great information to know. You have so much information. I look forward to learning more. Tell us how we can get your books.
Well, you can visit me at www.chefdrmike, that's Chef Dr. Mike, com, and all the information's are on the books are there. You can follow me on Amazon. They're all available on Amazon as well. And I'll just to let folks know, I'm working on my latest book, which will cover some of these non-ingredient related effects in terms of our health and how they apply in culinary medicine, called The Extraordinary Meal.
Okay. And so for the viewers, I am going to put up pictures of the books and where to get them at the end of this video. So make sure you see that, because this information is tremendous. I have practiced medicine for decades, and I took care of a lot of people with heart attacks, strokes, and so forth. Your information is invaluable, and it can save a lot of lives.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for being on the show today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. The pleasure was all ours, trust me. Bye-bye.